Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of Two Takes with Alex and Tate. We are guest starring my stepbrother, Max, over here today. Max, how are you doing?
Hey guys, happy to be with y'all.
Thank you for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. We thought we'd do something a little special today. So hopefully everyone had a great week. We have some really interesting college football coming up here today. That's why we wanted to knock this out a little bit early. We're not going to get too far into it, but Michigan and Ohio State, basically a playoff game today. If you go look at the standings, I don't know that both of those teams can get in. So de facto playoff game for those two teams. I think that's really interesting. And as an OU fan, the Oklahoma State game is a big game today because if they win, they're in the Big 12 championship game. If they lose, OU is in. So we're trying to knock this out so we can watch some college football. But we, of course, talk a lot of NFL in this podcast. And we have some huge games coming up tomorrow and already had some big games this week. So, Alex, what are we starting with today?
Yeah, so today I was getting thinking, it's starting to shape up what the playoffs are going to look like. We're coming into week 11. Yeah, pretty sure.
Week,
And
week 12.
week 12, week
Yeah.
12.
Yeah.
I just want it to keep going. You know what I mean? I just
Had
want
one job.
Uh, so today I was thinking we might start off with talking not who are the favorites, because that's pretty obvious to everybody who's been watching Kansas City. Some people say Baltimore, but those people might not be right. And Philly probably repeating this Super Bowl this year. But who are the favorites to upset the favorites from the AFC and the NFC? So I'm going to throw it over to our guest, Max. Who's your favorite NFC team that could upset Philly and push them out of the Super Bowl, probably in the conference championship?
So right now, there's really only two teams that you could throw into that picture, and it would make sense. Obviously, you have San Francisco and you have the Cowboys. What kind of sets both of those teams apart, I think, is how many pieces each team has. As we know, Philly has a ton of pieces. They've been really smart about picking up guys and kind of filling in spots that they were weak at. They got Swift this offseason. They went and got the safety from Tennessee. They filled in all the pieces that they would need and any weaknesses that they would have had. And I think that when you really look at that, San Francisco is probably my pick of who could be the upset. What is San Francisco's only weakness right now? Probably their quarterback, Brock Purdy. But as you can see through this past couple games, he actually is still able to piece together what he needs for them to be an elite, dominant team. Maybe halfway through the season there, we kind of got scared and it looked like it was maybe going to get rough with them. They went on that 3-game losing streak. But ever since their bye week, they've came back and really started to show that they're dominant again. They pick up Chase Young, and now all of a sudden they just are crushing their opponents. We saw them do it to Jacksonville the week before. That's a very powerful team in the league right now, and they shut them down and made them look silly. And then we just watched them do it to Seattle as well. I mean, I wouldn't put Geno Smith as an elite quarterback by any means, but they do have other pieces that should have played better. If we really want to look at a team that has the pieces, has the coach and the firepower to go in and kind of shut down the Eagles, especially the defense, it would definitely be San Francisco right now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good points there. I do not have San Francisco because I think San Francisco's biggest advantage that we always talk about is the roster being they usually, I think, overwhelm a lot of teams with the amount of talent they have on both sides of the ball. And you talked about Chase Young. I mean, if Chase Young is your second best defensive end, you are awesome on the defensive line. And that's really, really scary for most teams. I think Philly, like you touched on, matches up really well with San Francisco and has maybe the only roster in the league that could be considered as talented across the board. And we just talked about San Francisco's defensive line. Well, Philly's biggest strength is their offensive line. Now, I don't know that Philly's offensive line is quite as good as San Francisco's defense, but it's really close. And I think they could hold up in a game So in that specific matchup, I still like Philly more. So my biggest threat is actually Dallas. And I know that may come as a surprise to Alex. It may even come as a surprise to Max, even though I am a Dallas fan. But here's why. Divisional games are really hard anyway, and we have seen the Cowboys match up well with Philly and actually tend to play their best football, especially Dak, when they're playing Philadelphia. Dak lights up the Eagles secondary. Even in the game that they lost this year, Dak threw for, I think, 375 yards and really put together one of his best individual performances of the year against that defense. Now, I do like Philly. Some of the roster moves they made that Max touched on, they went with the freaking Saints first round pick this year. They went and got that defensive tackle whose name is slipping my mind, but from Georgia. Anyway, he's a stud and maybe defensive rookie of the year. Then they went and added a safety, Byard, who also, helped increase their, made their secondary a little better, which I thought was their weak link. But Dak still has shown that he can pick that defense apart. Kind of like what I talked about with Philly being able to block San Francisco, Dallas also has a really good offensive line and can kind of neutralize one of Philly's biggest strengths, which is their defensive line. And we talked about their secondary not being as good as the rest of the roster. I think almost anyone would agree that their secondary is the weak link on that team. So if the Cowboys can block them and hold up like we saw in the first game, I think they can have a lot of success through the air. And it's just hard to beat a team multiple times in a year. Philly obviously won the first matchup. We'll see what happens in the second matchup. But I think the more they play each other, the more difficult it is to keep winning those games. And it'll likely be in Philadelphia in the playoffs. I think the 1 seed is pretty clearly going to be Philly, which makes it tough. But I actually think Dallas, like I said, in that individual matchup, has a better chance to go to Philly and win that game than San Francisco does, because I still don't totally trust Brock Purdy. I think he's good. And, he makes like really nice looking throws, and I don't want to take anything away, but a couple times a game, he makes some decisions that I think could come back to bite him when they're playing an elite team. And I think when you're playing even Jacksonville, who's not quite Philadelphia, especially a team like Seattle, who you talked about, they have some nice pieces, but they're not on the upper echelon of NFL teams, I don't think. I think he gets away with some things, and I'm not sure he would get away with all that against Philly. And I think because Philly's so good on the other side of the ball, the margin for error for Brock would be really small. Now, they obviously have a great roster. Would I be stunned if they went and beat them? Not stunned, but in that specific matchup, I do like Dallas. Now, I want to give the caveat of, if you're asking me who I think could win 3 playoff games, I think San Francisco is a lot better bet than Dallas. Like what I could see happening, and this is obviously a hypothetical, but Dallas goes and beats the 4 seed, who's the Saints or whoever is going to win that terrible division. They go on the road, beat them, go to Philly and win a nail biter, and then they go get their ass kicked at San Francisco is absolutely what I could see. But as far as who I think could beat Philadelphia in a playoff game, that's why I like Dallas. It's just because it's a divisional game. They're familiar. I think they've shown that they play their best football against Philadelphia. And their roster, the Cowboys roster stacks up with almost everybody, including, I think, Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think both of those answers, you'd have to be kind of dumb to think it's anybody but one of those 3 teams. I just as a what's kind of surprising to us that Tate really called earlier in the season. I can't remember if it was on our podcast or if it was on while we were talking, is I had a lot of high hopes for Detroit coming in. And I was really thinking that this might be their year to like really push far into the playoffs. And I don't think that's going to happen now. Unfortunately, like we're starting to see Jared Goff come back down to earth a little bit. And that would have been my pick if I didn't watch them get dismantled by the
And
Pack.
what's even more important to me in the Detroit Packers game, instead of the eye test, what's even more important than the eye test to me of watching that game is the fact that they're done for getting the 1 seed. And I thought, okay, Jared Goff gets the 1 seed and maybe gets to play in that dome the whole playoffs, and they have teams coming to them. There might have been a window of opportunity for them to pull an upset against one of those teams, but I don't think they can go on the road and beat Philadelphia. In fact, I'd be stunned if they could. And I don't think they quite have the defense or the quarterback, frankly. It's like I just don't think they're quite there yet. I think they're a really fun team. They're one of the funnest teams to watch, frankly. They have some electric playmakers on offense. The defense gives up a lot of points, which is always kind of fun. So they're a great watch. They're a great story. I think they have reason to be optimistic for next year too. They should be even better next year. They don't have a lot of expensive contracts. Jared Goff is going to maintain probably, and they can get better around him. But yeah, I don't like them this year anymore. They needed to be the 1 seed to have a shot, I think, and it's not going to come to fruition for them.
Yeah, and that's kind of disappointing if you're from Detroit. But I mean, if you're from Detroit, your entire life's disappointing. So, anyways, Tate, you had to choose somebody who could upset your favorites of Kansas City Chiefs.
Right.
Who's it gonna be?
Yeah, and let me just say, I in this podcast and outside of this podcast have been pretty consistent that I thought Kansas City was going to be fine. I am concerned about the receivers after watching Philly, and I will admit that. And I think when you're playing a great team, the margin for error is obviously lower, and those drops, they obviously had a pass that they won them the game, and then on the 4th and 25, they had another one where they, it's like those are big plays. And could they have overcome it if Kelsey doesn't fumble or Mahomes doesn't throw a pick? Yeah, but those two guys are going to have to play perfectly in these big games, and they have very minimal margin for error if it's not 0 when they start playing the Phillies, even some of the other AFC teams, I think, in the league, So my biggest threat to upset them in the AFC, I'm going with Jacksonville. And I like Trevor Lawrence, obviously, a lot. I think they are a classic get hot at the end of the year candidate. And he turned it on this time last year. I think that last game he played with the 4 touchdowns, is definitely trending that way. I think they're really balanced on both sides of the ball. They have a good defense. They have a good pass rush. If they get the lead, they can get after you. Travis Etienne has been maybe the second best running back in the whole league this year behind Christian McCaffrey. He's at least been the second most productive, really. And, I like that if they get the lead, he is able to kind of carry them to the finish line a lot. And they've kind of needed it because up to this point, they haven't been particularly great in the red zone, especially Trevor hasn't been what you would expect or hope from him in the red zone so far this year. And Travis Etienne has kind of been that key piece where they can capitalize on these drives, especially in the second half of games where they, end up getting the lead. So far, they have been really healthy, and they just got Zay Jones back. And that's one of the key, I think, points about these AFC teams and why I like Jacksonville is obviously Cincinnati would have been an option. Joe Burrow goes down. The Ravens, I really like. I think they're awesome. I think Mark Andrews is a really big injury for that Kansas City matchup specifically, and so I like Jacksonville. I think they have shown the ability to overcome adversity, both as a franchise, getting things turned around from the whole Urban Meyer debacle. And then even last year in the playoffs, they go down 27-0. Trevor throws 4 picks in the first half, and they're able to come back and win that game. Now, would you have rather not thrown 4 picks in the first half? Of course, but it says something to me that they were still able to come back. They were able to gain their composure, and they were able to pull out a victory in a playoff game. And then they played relatively well going to Arrowhead. No shame in losing to the Chiefs. You know, they ended up winning the Super Bowl. No shame in losing that game. And I actually think it's still on the board that they could get the 1 seed. I don't think the Dolphins are going to run the table. And Kansas City, I just don't see that. I see them losing one more game at least, finishing about 13-4. And Jacksonville actually plays Baltimore down the stretch here. And if they can beat Houston, the rest of their games are winnable, including that Baltimore game. And if they could end up winning the Baltimore game, they should have the inside track and kind of control their own destiny for the 1 seed. And that would be big. Now, like obviously getting the bye, but having everyone having to come through Jacksonville, which is a little bit of a college football atmosphere, I think the fans would be rocking for the playoffs. I think the weather would benefit them. They don't have, obviously it'd be nice in Jacksonville, wouldn't have to worry about any sort of inclement weather or anything like that. But even if they don't get the 1 seed, they have the kind of team that could have success on the road in the playoffs with the being able to run the ball. Trevor, obviously, big quarterback, big hands, big arm. He can go play in cold weather. He played in cold weather when he was at Clemson plenty. And then I think like I said, I just think they're a get hot candidate. And I think if they're streaking at the right time, they are definitely a dangerous team in the AFC. I like them the most to pull the upset against Kansas City, maybe get to the Super Bowl this year.
I have to say, after sitting there listening to your argument, I have to agree with that on the most part, just because before, this last 2 weeks, we probably would have said Cincinnati or the Ravens, obviously, but you lose
Absolutely.
Joe Burrow, you lose Mark Andrews, and the AFC becomes very different. The only thing I would say that kind of maybe doesn't go with that is that I believe that Miami showed us yesterday that they don't need Tua to have elite games every game for them to be able to win. Their defense stepped up. They have Jalen Ramsey back. They stepped up and they looked like an elite defense. It was kind of like a Dallas Cowboys defense type of day for them. And
Sure.
I think that Miami definitely has a little bit more superpower on their offensive side than Jacksonville does. I mean, you put Tyreek Hill up next to Calvin Ridley, put Jalen Waddle up next to Calvin Ridley. I'd take both of them over Calvin Ridley. Put
Yeah.
both of those guys up next to Christian Kirk. I'd take both of those guys over Christian Kirk.
Yeah.
Only I think advantage that Jacksonville has is Etienne has had a better year than Mostert, but you know what? I don't know that Etienne is a better running back than A-Chain is. And I think that as A-Chain starts to warm up, we may see, a new sensation come alive in the league as we started to see before he got hurt. I really think that Kansas City has one thing going for them that a lot of other teams don't, is that their defense has been probably one of the more consistent defenses in the league throughout the year. And, they do need another receiver, but they always have Pacheco who can step up. And, if you have the trifecta of Pacheco, Kelsey, and Mahomes rolling, then you're good as long as your defense looks like themselves.
Sure.
But, as we've all seen, the Jets are considered one of the better defenses in the league, and nobody can stop Tyreek Hill. So,
Right.
I like Jacksonville, but I'm not going to say I like them more than Miami to upset Kansas City. It's kind of like okay, there's only 3-team situation, just like we say for the NFC also. I mean, you have Miami, you have Kansas City, and you have Jacksonville now. The Bills, okay, they could come back alive, but from what we've seen, they're struggling. They fired their offensive coordinator.
Right.
Stephon Diggs doesn't look like he's going to keep going off with, Josh Allen like he has in the past. That chemistry seems like it's kind of fading there. So, I'm not going to say Jacksonville over everyone, but I'm going to say Jacksonville and Miami definitely are the 2 teams that could do it.
Here's my concern with Miami. And you could say the same concern about Dallas, who I liked in the NFC, but Miami has played by far their worst games, especially on offense when they've played good teams. They put up 20 against Buffalo, they put up 14 against Kansas City, and we have seen not just the offense in general, but Tyreek Hill has had his quietest games when they play really, really good teams. And as far as a matchup versus Kansas City, now I'm not going to speak to the Jacksonville matchup, but Kansas City has the kind of defense that we've already seen can slow down Miami, right? They had their worst game of the year when they played Kansas City. I know it was in Germany, but that's what concerns me about Miami is, are they good enough in the trenches? Are they good enough on defense? They just lost Phillips on the defensive line. I know they got Jalen Ramsey back, who's a hell of a player, but I don't know that they're quite good enough to compete and be physical enough with these really, really upper echelon teams like Kansas City. And that's my concern. And Tua, we all like Tua. As far as who's a guy who can kind of put the team on his back in the fourth quarter of a playoff game and really come up with some big time plays off script, making high level throws in cold weather. I like Trevor Lawrence more than Tua. I know Tua has obviously had a better year up to this point. That's not something I'm going to even try to debate. But, as far as who's got the ability to turn it on late in a playoff game in cold weather, I like Trevor Lawrence a little more. Not going to argue with you about the receivers. Obviously, Tyreek Hill, probably the best receiver in the league. I know Justin Jefferson went down. It's hard to say he's not the best receiver in the league right now. And Jalen Waddle is probably the best second receiver on any team in the league. So they are tough if they get going. But can they hold up on the offensive line? Can they get going against one of these elite defenses like Kansas City or even Baltimore? I think they would have a really, really hard time with, even though Mark Andrews is out. I don't know that I like them to be able to go to Baltimore and to Kansas City. Now, just like I thought, I said Jacksonville alive for the 1 seed. If Miami can find a way to get the 1 seed, they are dangerous, I think. Where they have all the games in good weather, teams have to go to Miami and play. I think that atmosphere would also be electric and be really difficult to play. And, one thing, just touching on the Ravens real quick, that people may not realize is Trevor Lawrence has already had more postseason success than Lamar. So that's why, as far as if Miami were to get the 1 seed, Baltimore, I think that's a big ask for them to have to go to Miami. Now, Patrick Mahomes hasn't yet, because every playoff game he's ever played has been at Arrowhead. I don't think anyone doubts his ability to go perform on the road in a playoff game. I think he's kind of past that. So I could see Miami. I am a little worried that when they play a really physical team, they will get bullied a little bit, and that Tua won't quite be able to make some of the tight-knit throws once the timing gets knocked off a little bit. He's very much a rhythm player. If Chris Jones can pressure the quarterback, or if the great Kansas City corners can hold up in coverage long enough that they can mess with the timing of that Miami offense, I worry about what they're going to do for like their second pitch, kind of, you know what I mean? So that, I think that's a good answer. And Miami is a fun team to watch, but I think that the ceiling for Jacksonville to me is higher. Now, they haven't played as well, but even the ceiling for the Ravens, I think, is higher than the ceiling for the Dolphins, which may sound kind of funny because they beat a team and hung 70 on them. But, it's like when we're talking about who can really play with the best of the best, I do like the Ravens and Jacksonville more than I like Miami.
If I could just say one thing to that argument, though, I agree with that on the most part, but I think that whenever you're talking about Miami having a hard time with some of the more physical defenses, you almost have amnesia about what happened 2 weeks ago with Jacksonville and San Francisco. They were embarrassed, shut down, and completely beat up. So if there's two teams that have both struggled with very, very good defenses, Jacksonville is just as much in that as Miami is. And I don't think that that's really enough of an edge to discount Miami yet. Now, does Trevor Lawrence have more playoff experience? Surprisingly, yes, he does. But that would be the only advantage I'll give him there.
Yeah, and part of my take, just to be clear, is some projection of who I think could get hot at the end of the year. And Jacksonville obviously hasn't played as good as Miami. And if you ask me 2 weeks ago, if we're going to play a game, get a time machine, go back to 2 weeks, I would think Miami would have a better chance. But like as the season progresses, I think Jacksonville, a little more of a physical team, a little more of a cold weather team, a little more of a playoff kind of team. And they are going to have to play better. And Trevor is going to have to look like what we saw last week instead of what we saw for the first couple of weeks of the season, for sure, for that to come to fruition. And that is, yeah, that's a good point.
That's fair. That's fair.
San Francisco did beat the heck out of them, but they do that to a lot of teams, like Dallas can play with Philly, but I don't have any confidence they go to San Francisco win a playoff game. You know what I mean? Like they just, if you're not used to playing in San Francisco, they can beat the shit out of you, to be honest.
As we just saw.
Right. Yeah, they really are. Yeah, because Seattle's a pretty good team. Like Seattle's not a terrible team. They're not a number one contender in the NFC, but they're not a slouch. They're not a tomato can or anything like that. It's like
They have all the talent in the world. It's just Gino freezes up more often than he shouldn't. He forgot how to throw the ball away. So
it's looking
ate
like
him a lot.
Gino's season last year is becoming more and more of an outlier a little bit. And I like Gino. I think he's a good story, but he's done. They're probably a candidate to maybe draft a quarterback late in the first year, or even try to move
100%.
up. And so yeah.
All right, you guys laid out so much good information. I got to touch on a little bit of it.
Sure.
Yeah, Tate, I would tend to agree with you on Jacksonville. I think we could see them start to get a little bit hot as the season goes on. I do have questions about their offensive efficiency because it always seems like they turn the corner and then they'll have like a stumble. We see Trevor Lawrence turn into Danny Drops every once in a while, like every 3 weeks. It's real disappointing. I think if he can keep that focus and keep the edge going, we see him play a lot more to his ceiling than to his floor, which I agree is probably a little bit higher than say Tua's or even Josh Allen's at this point.
Sure.
And that's getting back to Max's point about, yeah, we're not going to talk about Buffalo because
Alex hates Buffalo.
in Colin that there's going to be an implosion in either Miami or Buffalo since the beginning of this year, and we've been dead money on Miami. It's bad, but we've been exactly right on Buffalo. And yeah, Josh Allen, September champ, whatever we want to say, out of the next category that we're going to talk about. But what I will say to Max about the Dolphins, and kind of playing on what Tate was talking about with, getting Tua out of his rhythm. The Dolphins, top to bottom, are a rhythm team. Like, if you just look at their game plan for any game that they're going into, the goal is to put up as many points as possible quickly so that they don't have to have their defense out as much. It's all about timing for them from the very starting whistle. So like I would think that their defense is truly what's going to hold them back because their defense cannot limit good teams. Like you said, that they looked pretty elite, like their defense was coming into its own with this last game. Let's remember who they played.
Yeah, Tim Boyle is maybe the worst quarterback we've seen take a snap in the NFL this year.
Fair enough.
Shout out to yeah.
Might be a little fool's gold there. I would put my money on the Ravens if any team is going to really upset, because and I still don't like the Ravens because they play in the AFC North where their defense is pretty much forged in like the heart of Mordor. If you're going to play in the AFC North, your defense has to be outstanding because that's what separates those teams from going like 2-4 within the division. But the reason I don't really want to commit to Baltimore, it's because exactly what Tate mentioned, any team that sees Lamar Jackson play a couple of times a year is going to have their number on one of those games. Yeah. And usually it comes in the postseason. Right. So it's really hard to say with confidence that any of these three teams of Miami, Jacksonville, or Baltimore are really going to make a push at Kansas City. So I don't know. I hesitate to commit to any of them, but I swear to God, if we're all wrong and Buffalo ends up in the Super Bowl, I'm going to be so disappointed in myself first and foremost, but I don't see it happening.
So
All right.
just a couple things real quick. So what you said about Miami, I think is correct, where when they play a defense that can kind of limit the chunk plays, they're not really an offense that's trying to sustain 12 play drives and be on the field for 10 minutes. They're trying to pick up chunk yards, have these explosive plays to the receivers and Achane, these speedy guys that they have, and get in the end zone quick. And then lastly, the thing about the AFC that in Max, I don't know if you know this, before Joe Burrow got hurt, I told Alex I thought Cincinnati was going to go to the Super Bowl. I don't think there's a perfect team in the AFC. And I think this kind of a little bit back to Philly really seems like Philly needs to try to win the Super Bowl this year. I know they're obviously going to try, but like the window is there for them because I think every team in the AFC has flaws. The Ravens, especially without Mark Andrews, do you just trust Lamar Jackson? The Chiefs, Kelsey unfortunately looks like Father Time is gaining on him, and who else is going to catch the ball? The Dolphins, we've talked about them plenty in Jacksonville. They got to play better. So it's like, I don't know that there's a perfect team in the AFC. So the NFC, take note, Philadelphia, you need to, if you're going to win one, this may be the year to try to do it,
Right.
All right. So that brings us all the way around to the next category. Who should be the MVP favorite right now, or who do you see winning it? And tell us why. We'll start off with Max on this one.
Okay. For me, it's pretty simple, not just because I graduated from Tech, but because we're all watching the same thing happen, and that's Patrick Mahomes. I think that, MVP wise, there's a lot of different things and a lot of facets to that conversation that makes someone the MVP. Sometimes it has a lot to do with just popularity in the league, unfortunately. But what this has to do with is the fact that Patrick Mahomes has shown what an MVP should show, and that is putting a team on your back and carrying them. Going into the season, everybody had a ton of questions about them because they didn't really do anything to acquire a superstar receiver. They were also going back into just relying on the old Mahomes and Kelsey duo there to do well. And a lot of people thought we were going to see a lot of regression from them over the season. But it's been quite the opposite. They've had maybe two bad losses. One of them, Mahomes had the flu. Like, what can you say? The dude was sick as could be, and he still went out there and played. But other than that, he's gone out there with probably the most limited amount of star power out of any winning team in the league right now, and just willed them into wins week after week and really carried the team to being one of the top teams in the league right now and being the number one seed favorite for the AFC. What more do you need out of a player to get an MVP candidate and win that? He is doing what an MVP does, and that's showing that him alone can make a team be successful. And for me, I think that there's really no argument that matches up to that as well right now as something that is just as obvious that we're all watching happen, that we all know exactly is what's going on, is that they don't have the star power, and he's doing that. So I'm all in for Mahomes. I think that it's, pretty obvious.
Okay, let me just say, I love that answer. That's not who I had, but everyone knows who the best player in the league is. It's obviously Pat. They're the one seed. I love the answer. You're really speaking my language with the Patrick Mahomes talk. But unfortunately for Patrick Mahomes, why I don't think he's going to win it this year is he's kind of a victim of his own success. And by his own standard, he's not having a great year. If someone else were doing what Patrick Mahomes was doing, I think they would be probably the favorite to win the MVP. I'm not going to lie. I think if someone was taking those receivers, an aging tight end, and a defense and being the one seed, I think you're absolutely right. He has a case to be the MVP. But even eye test wise, he hasn't been playing as good as we've seen him play almost every other year. He's been a starter in the league. And some of that is probably the team around him, of course. But like I said, he has made it look so effortlessly, and he's been so efficient in the past. And he has a few more turnovers, like the pick in the end zone against Philly. It's like there's a few more of those kind of plays that I think are going to end up being the reason why he doesn't win it. And I think if it, like I said, if it was somebody else, I think they absolutely would be one of the favorites, if not the favorites to win it. That's doing what Pat is doing. So my guy that I think is going to win the MVP is in a similar boat as Patrick Mahomes. And like I said, if someone else was doing what Pat was doing, I think they would be the MVP. And I think that guy CJ Stroud. And I think he has taken what was a total dumpster fire and what was, obviously the second worst team in the league last year and has made them a playoff team, even though his best receiver is a rookie in Tank Dell. Nico Collins, I like a lot, but I think Tank is the guy out there. And to be having the success that he's having without a great defense, without a great offensive line, he doesn't have a Travis Kelce on his team, and he is lighting it up. I think speaks volumes that his character to come in and do that as a rookie. And I think he should win the MVP. And if you look at, he's got some signature wins this year, which I think is important. Beat Jacksonville early. Recently, they beat Cincinnati before Burrow went down in a clutch game where, he had to drive down the field at the end, and get that field goal. Even going back to the Tampa Bay game where Baker puts together a great drive to go up by 5, and then CJ comes down and wins the game with a touchdown at the end. I think he's had the most MVP moments so far this season. Now, he also had a 3 interception game. They ended up winning it, but that's a lot of picks to throw in a game for an MVP candidate. It is not very common, obviously, that it goes to a rookie. I think I could be wrong about this. I think the last rookie to win MVP was Earl Campbell, a running back way back when. I think that's the last one that did it. But his clutch play, I think he has been by far the best player on that team. Again, they don't have the great defense that Kansas City has. They don't have a weapon like Travis Kelce. They don't have the offensive line. And there's not really a clear other candidate to me that should be the overwhelming favorite or anything like that. We touched on Patrick Mahomes. I love Patrick Mahomes. I take Mahomes 8 days a week and twice on Sunday, you know what I mean, to be my quarterback. But even by his own standard, he hasn't played up to the level we expect Patrick Mahomes to play at. Jalen's kind of the same thing. I like Jalen. I think he's got a really good case, but he hasn't been as good as he was last year. And he didn't win the MVP last year. Now he got hurt. But eye test, counting numbers, any way you look at it, Jalen hasn't been quite as good as last year. Lamar, he's not exactly lighting it up. The team is awesome, but he hasn't put up just the eye-popping MVP level stats. Dak Prescott, some people doesn't really, have a signature win. He's looked really good against some bad teams. But, we talked about the Philly game, one of his best performances. They didn't win that game. So he doesn't really have a signature win. And then I know some people have talked about Brock Purdy. I'm glad that none of us really talked about him for the MVP because he's maybe the 5th best player on his own offense, not just the team, but I don't think Brock Purdy is obviously as good as Christian McCaffrey or Trent Williams. Ayuk, I think there's a real conversation. George Kittle, there's a real conversation. Debo is obviously awesome. So that's why I don't like Brock to win the MVP. So to me, if we're saying that a rookie can win the MVP, I think CJ Stroud is looking really good. And if they make the playoffs, I think he should win it. And that's who would have my vote, I have to say. So
Good argument.
I like it. I like both of them. I look at MVP and I just look at what it actually stands for. Most valuable player. It doesn't always have to be the player that puts up the most stats or as it's become now, like the best quarterback, because that's
right.
It's going to always be a quarterback. It's the most important position on the field, etc. Right. Great, whatever, fine. What I have to say, if San Francisco supplants the Philadelphia Eagles as the 1 seed in the NFC, which the Eagles have to win the next 3 games, are the hardest on the Eagles schedule. It's Buffalo, it's San Fran, and it's the Cowboys. And if they lose any of those, and accidentally drop one, San Francisco's looking real good for the rest of the season to be the 1 seed. If that happens, I think it has to be George Kittle. He doesn't always get all of the touchdowns, except whenever they play the Cowboys. And it's real bad. He's not putting up, over 100 yards in receiving every week. But what he does is probably the most valuable thing that you can do as a tight end. He's the go-to pressure release valve for any, and I've said this for years, for any rookie quarterback. You need a good offensive line and you need a great tight end, because that is their first kind of go-to. All right, I know I have receivers that are fast. I know I've got a running back that can help me out. But if you want to see them pass, watch them pass to their tight end. And if the tight end is fantastic, he's going to end up being somebody like George Kittle. So he's a great safety valve for Brock Purdy, and he offers enough to where teams want to double team him for those check down situations that allows Ayuk, Samuel, and McCaffrey to just stack all of their stats. And I think that role, more than Brock Purdy or more than any one of those other three who have had a crazy year up until this point, those are all facilitated by George Kittle. And so if we see them going into the first seed, if they win out, which is possible at this point, then it would have to be because of the explosiveness that Kittle has. That would be my argument. Obviously, it's going to a quarterback. 99% of it is going to be Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah.
And then
I don't hate that answer, because George Kittle deserves a lot of credit for the success of the San Francisco running game. And people before Travis Kelce kept having the sustained success maybe 4 or 5 years ago. People talked about George Kittle as being a little better than Travis Kelce because of what he supplies in the running game as a great elite level blocker as a tight end, and his ability to make big plays in the passing game. Unfortunately for George Kittle, if a non-quarterback is going to win the MVP, it's going to be McCaffrey, who has put up better numbers on his own team. Or if it's going to go to a non-quarterback, Tyreek Hill may be the first receiver to have 2,000 yards. And so that's where he's quite a bit down the list, probably, even if you look at the non-quarterbacks. But I think, to your point, he's an undervalued player maybe right now, because he doesn't always put up the crazy stat lines, but he's really, really imperative to what they want to do on offense from a week-to-week basis. So that's where I will give you some credit and agree with you a little bit. But if you're looking at who's going to vote for the MVP and what people are going to look at, he doesn't quite have the numbers, even compared to some other non-quarterbacks on his own team, right? And then we know it's going to go to a quarterback anyway, because when Derrick Henry had 2,000 yards a few years ago, and I know Max had him on fantasy that year, but when he had 2,000 yards and didn't win the MVP, it became very clear. It's like, okay, so it's just a quarterback award, because Derrick Henry had the best season by a running back we've seen in a long time, and wasn't even, I don't think, second in MVP voting that year. So it's like, okay, it's just going to be a quarterback award. So that's where you kind of have to look at it. Another guy that kind of sneaky MVP candidate would be Myles Garrett. Awfully good on the defensive side of the ball. Even the Cowboys cornerback, who's set the record for pick sixes, who wasn't even supposed to be a starter, has been awesome. But as we know, it's going to be the only player I see that's not a quarterback with a shot is Tyreek Hill, because he's going to do something historical. And I think that's what it would take for a non-quarterback to win the MVP, is to put up, like what Tyreek might do, a 2,000-yard season, which we've never seen from a receiver before. So,
oh yeah, that's why I was just saying, as a facilitator, that Kittle, but like otherwise, no. As if you're looking at stats, obviously almost anybody else. But all right. Well, we're gonna make a little bit of a switch here, changing gears. Hope we don't grind the clutch. What we're gonna talk about the NBA. Max is gonna go see Victor Wembanyama, right?
Right. Yeah, so Max is going to a Spurs game with one of our buddies. And yeah, my question for Max is we've talked a lot about Wembanyama not on the podcast. What do you think his ceiling is, and what do you want to see from him when you see him live as a rookie?
Oh man. So I mean, what it's kind of a hard question because it's like, what is Wemby's ceiling? Well, how do you gauge that when you've never even had a player in the league that, is like him at all? You know what I mean? How do
Right.
you even start to try to gauge that? I think that what is his ceiling? I think that, Wemby should be a league MVP in the next 2 years if he, continues to play like, we've seen him play in his rookie season. He's came out and been amazing on offense. He's had some great defensive plays as well. I mean, but what do you want to see out of Wemby as he matures in the league? We need to see his defense come alive. You don't have, that wingspan and that size for nothing, man. You got to be able to shut people down. I think we just saw Harden piece him up the other night. Don't let James Harden, who's washed and is being smothered by teams on a weekly basis, come in and break your ankles and then do a layup on you. You're over 7 foot tall. Knock that out of the arena, man.
Right.
Use that arm, use that wingspan to your advantage. Let's see you not only put up 30 points, 35 points. Let's see you, put up 3 or 4 blocks. Let's see you put up some amazing defensive stat lines that will set you apart in the defensive category as well. Now, with that being said, we saw him have some great defensive play on Kevin Durant, which, is obviously one of the best players in the league. But, if you're going to be that guy, then you have to not only be an offensive guy, but you have to be able to come back down and, knock it off the backboard and make a few defensive plays as well and shut down some of the bigs in the league as well. Put on some weight, Wemby. Get on a good diet plan. Let's see you, add 80 to 100 pounds, if that's possible, onto your body here and muscle and try to make something shake that way. But when I go and see Wemby, I'm not expecting him to put on a league MVP game, but I want to see him with some fun dunks. I want to see some good alley-oops. I want to see him at least put up 20 plus, and give us a show. That's all you really want out of Wemby right now, and then hope that the rest comes together with time.
Yeah, so I've said I think in 4 years he may be the best player in the league. I think 2, we'll have to see the kind of pieces they put around him to help him develop. I think the Spurs need to get a true point guard who can kind of help his offensive game by putting him in positions that he's more comfortable in. They don't really have a point guard, and he sometimes isn't as involved in the offense as you would like to see, but he has shown flashes of brilliance on offense. He is already, I think, the best rim protector in the league, but to Max's point, needs to work on the on-ball defense, right? And that's like, he has the wingspan, obviously, at 7'5", the height and the jumping ability, where when he's off the ball, he is an incredibly effective rim protector, but he needs to work on his footwork, hone some of those skills as far as being an on-ball defender. So that is something I hope that he can improve over time. Putting on some weight, I think, is a good idea. Let's start with like 10 pounds before we start talking 100 pounds. Like, that's a lot.
He's a guy that he puts on 100.
Maybe 15 or 20 before next season.
Y'all heard it here first.
100
Wemby
pounds.
in 2 weeks with Zion.
Right. Yeah. Like, Jesus. But no, I'm excited that you're getting to go see that game, man, because I think he is, to your point, unlike anything we've ever seen before. And even on TV, he looks fake. So, like, I just can't imagine. I'm jealous. It's like, I can't imagine what he's going to look like in person for you when you go see him. It's like, what a fun game. What a fun team to get to go see. Even though they're not any good as a team right now. They're, I think, the worst team in the league as far as
They're
record.
playing Chicago, so I mean it's going to be a competitive game.
Yeah, it'll be competitive. Yeah.
So.
And in San Antonio should be fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, all right. So final thing. Before this year started, we were asking each other some pretty hot takes So
Yeah, for the fans that don't know, somewhere floating around in the ether, we did an early episode of the podcast with Max and we lost it. And unfortunately, it was a great episode. You just have to take our word for it. I really thought it went well, but it is somewhere floating around and we can't find it despite numerous emails to Zoom that we record these podcasts on. Don't know exactly where it went. So me and Alex talked about some of our best takes and worst takes a couple of weeks ago. Max, what do you think your best take going into the year was? Or what do you think your worst take was?
I'll go with my worst take first. And I actually discussed this on that episode. And I had the Chargers being a serious AFC contender. I had, the new offensive coordinator. They were healthy finally. I had them coming in and really shaking things up. I had Herbert coming in and really being the MVP of the league this
I did
year.
too. I did too.
And um, that's just fizzled. And I mean, it's like, and you can't even blame it being that Mike Williams is hurt. He's always hurt. You know what I mean? It's more, I think it's a lot of defensive mishaps when you have, and then here's the thing, you have Bosa and Khalil Mack. Now Khalil Mack is leading some of the defensive.
Oh, did
we
we lose it?
might have just lost Max for a minute. So
So, in case he doesn't come back, to his point on the Chargers, that was also a team I was really high on going to the year. I thought, just like he said, Justin Herbert had a real shot to win the MVP, but unfortunately, they can't get it together. And I thought their coach should have been fired last year. Okay, so we lost Max. We will bring him back to answer those questions at another time. I thought Justin Herbert had a real chance to be the MVP, but after the loss to the Jacksonville Jaguars in the playoffs last year, I thought there was no way that he was going to be able to keep that locker room and keep everyone bought in and keep everyone invested. And unfortunately for Chargers fans, that is exactly what's happened, and they missed the boat on Sean Payton. Now, there are going to be some head coaching candidates that I think could be good for the Chargers. So we'll see if they make any moves. Yeah. So Chargers, that was also a take that I was wrong on. So we will have to, everyone I know is on the edge of their seat to see what they thought. Oh, is he
I'm
back?
back.
There he is.
Oh my gosh. What the hell? Okay. All right. So can I pick back up where I was?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay. So like I was saying, I had the Chargers as AFC favorite to come in and really shake things up in the AFC. I had them as a team that could beat the Chiefs any given week, and that they were going to be an offensive superpower that was fun to watch. I think we've seen some of those games out of Eckler and Herbert, and especially Keenan Allen by far, but we haven't really seen their defense come together and shut down teams like they need to. Their play calling isn't where it needs to be. I mean, they need to fire their head coach. Like that guy, you've been saying this for years. You never believed in him. You always thought that he needs to be fired. And I can say that that's probably been one of your more accurate takes. So if you're looking at a long-term good take, that is 100% like one that you've been dead on. They need to get that guy out of there. They should have brought on Sean Payton. They should have, gosh, I mean, really anybody. This guy's rode the wave of a super talented team, so
All right. Well,
it's
I said this while you were off the screen. I can't believe they didn't fire him after that Jacksonville game. Because after a game like that and the failures they had in the past, even going back to the year before, I just didn't see him keeping the locker room invested and bought in. You know what I mean? And I think
right.
that's exactly what we've seen where the players from Austin Eckler to some of the guys on the defense are really frustrated with the coaching. And as much as they spend on the defensive side of the ball, you just flatly have to be better, especially as a
Yeah.
defensive head coach. You just flatly have to be better on defense than they are.
Yeah, and he's supposed to be a defensive coach, apparently.
Right.
I mean, that was him. And it's like, bro, your team has been the opposite of that. So definitely that was my worst take. I think I spent 5 minutes explaining how they were going to be the team in that episode that we're looking for. So, that was my worst take. Now, by far my best take of the year has been Lamb, man. As y'all all know, we are big fantasy football guys. And I was going on, for the most part saying that I thought that Lamb was going to be, I thought that he was going to have one of his best years yet, which he has, and that he was going to finally be in that wide receiver one conversation, which was great because I was able to get him as a wide receiver two in almost all my leagues, with the exception of Dynasty. And now, I have him putting up wide receiver one numbers while Diggs is about to fall off and kill me, I think. Hopefully not. Fingers crossed. But I saw Lamb coming in and finally being that top tier receiver that we all thought he could be, that he just hasn't been yet. And I'm happy about that take. That was one that's been successful for me in the long run.
Where do you have, and this is real life, not where do you have CD Lamb as far as receiver rankings go? Because I would have Justin Jefferson and Tyreek Hill ahead of him. I like Jamar Chase. Where would you have him on your, if you're
Are
just
we going off of all time or this year?
Keep it simple. Let's do this year.
neither
Okay.
and both is what I would say.
Well, it changes.
It's tapestry when you're trying to rank players. So here,
Well,
if you're going to,
this year I have AJ Brown and Tyreek Hill ahead of him. Obviously, I think him and AJ Brown have the exact same amount of receiving yards right now, which is funny. But AJ Brown's just looked a little bit better eye test wise. You know what I mean? So I got AJ Brown and Tyreek Hill ahead of him this year. If Justin Jefferson was still healthy and playing, obviously he would be ahead of him, but he's just not relevant to the conversation because he's been out. You know what I mean?
right.
Now we all know that he's better than almost all those guys mentioned, with the exception of maybe Tyreek Hill. If Chase had a healthy Burrow, would he probably be ahead of him? Yeah, but he doesn't. So for this year, I have Lamb as like the number 3 receiver in the league. All time, I probably have him more like at number 5. And
Right.
and I would say that that's probably the only way I can really answer that question is by saying, okay, this year here he is over all time. This is where he's at, but he could easily go to that number 3 position, but it's going to take a couple years of this production to like claim that.
So when I rank my players, it's basically like in a vacuum. If every player in the league was a free agent, what would be the receivers I would draft for a short amount of time, but enough time to have a real impact, at least a year and a half or something like that. You know what I mean? A couple playoff runs. Who would I want? That's kind of how I always rank my guys. And I've been saying it this year, and I stand by it, but I'm gonna add a wrinkle to it. I think CeeDee Lamb is at the top of the second tier guys, meaning my first tier would be Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. I think AJ Brown has supplanted himself in the top tier, and Tyreek Hill. AJ Brown may be kind of the bottom of the top tier, and then I would have CeeDee Lamb right there at the top of the next list of guys, with the Stephon Diggs of the world, people like Mike Evans a lot. There's a few guys that would be in that next group. I think CeeDee Lamb is at the top of that next group. But I will say this, he is looking like someone that could move into that elite upper echelon of receivers, because he has been on he's just been unbelievable, especially the last 5 weeks. He has been remarkable. He has shown he's kind of this freak athlete where he's got that lean. I compare him to Michael Jordan because he's skinny. He doesn't look like a big guy, but he's so strong. And he's shown the ability to make elite level catches and do it on a consistent basis and do it against some of the better defenses in the league. And those are all things you look for as far as the guys that you consider the top A-list receivers in the league. Can they do it when their quarterback is having a rough game as far as timing goes? Can they do it against good defenses? Can they beat elite level corners one-on-one? And then can they do it consistently week after week after week? And CeeDee Lamb's stretch of 150-yard games broke the NFL record. I think it was 3 in a row. Even this, on Thanksgiving Day, he kind of had a quiet game by his standard, and he had, still put up a stat line, still caught a touchdown pass, still, I know it was good for fantasy football purposes. So that's kind of an indicator sometimes that, how good, from a stat standpoint, if they're still putting up their numbers. So he has been awesome this year. I want to see it. Like you said, I want to see it for a little bit more. I love CeeDee Lamb. He's obviously an OU guy, so I'm rooting for him. I want to see him move into that upper echelon, but there's still some work to be done before I think he is fully in that elite group. But he is not someone that could never be in that top tier. You know what I mean? And I think he's on his way.
Oh, yeah.
So nicely done.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, I'm gonna let Tate send us off, but this was so much fun, Max. We're gonna have to have you on.
Yes.
Yeah, Max, thank you for joining us. We want to thank everyone for listening. I'm going to go watch this Michigan-Ohio State football game. I'm very interested in it. Great job, everybody, today. Like I said, we want to thank Max again and thank you to everyone who has been listening. And we will see y'all next week.
All right, guys. See you. It's been fun.